In the bitter cold of January 1877, inside a dimly lit bedroom at number 10 Washington Place in New York City, a man lay dying. Outside, the city was transforming, growing taller and louder, a metropolis on the verge of becoming the center of the world. Inside, the silence was heavy. The man in the bed was 82 years old. His skin was pale, his frame frail, ravaged by stomach complications and the sheer exhaustion of a life lived at full throttle. But his eyes, even in these final moments, held a terrifying sharpness. This was Cornelius Vanderbilt, known to the world simply as the Commodore. He was the richest man in the United States, possessing a fortune of $100 million. To put that in perspective, at the time of his death, he owned one out of every $20 in circulation in the entire American economy. He had more money than the United States Treasury. Surrounding his bedside were his family members, waiting for the end of a titan who had dominated their lives with the same ruthlessness he had used to dominate the oceans and the railroads. They were waiting for the inheritance that would make them American royalty. They were waiting for the power to pass from one hand to another. But as the Commodore took his final breaths, a question hung in the air, one that the old man had wrestled with for years. Could this fortune survive him? He had built an empire from nothing, rising from an uneducated boatman to the king of capitalism. He knew how to make money, and he knew how to hoard it. But he did not trust his heirs to keep it. He had famously said that any fool can make a fortune, but it takes a man of brains to hold on to it. As the snow fell on New York that night, the Commodore died, leaving behind a legacy that would define the Gilded Age. But within 70 years of that cold night, the vast majority of that empire would be gone. The mansions would be demolished, the influence evaporated, and the family scattered. This is the story of the rise and fall of the House of Vanderbilt, a saga of ambition, greed, excess, and ultimate tragedy. If you are ready to uncover the secrets of America's greatest dynasty, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are about to embark on a journey through history that reveals the dark side of the American dream. To understand the fall, we must first understand the climb. And the climb began at the very bottom. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, which was then a rural, isolated community of farmers and watermen. He was not born into wealth. His father was a struggler, a man who worked hard but never seemed to get ahead. Young Cornelius was different. He was big for his age, strong, and intensely stubborn. He had little patience for school. By the age of 11, he had quit his studies to work on the waterfront. He could barely spell, his grammar was atrocious, and he was rough around the edges, but he possessed an intuitive genius for business and numbers that no classroom could teach. He saw the water not just as scenery, but as a highway. Staten Island was separated from Manhattan by the harbor, and in those days, before bridges and tunnels, the only way across was by boat. At age 16, Cornelius made a deal with his mother. If she would lend him $100, a significant sum in 1810, he would clear a rocky, overgrown field for farming. He did the work, got the money, and bought a small two-masted sailing vessel known as a periauger. This was the seat of the Vanderbilt Empire. He named the boat the Swiftsure. He didn't care about comfort. He cared about speed and volume. He began ferrying passengers and produced from Staten Island to Manhattan. He worked harder than anyone else. When other boatmen were drinking in the taverns, Cornelius was on the water. When the weather was foul and other captains stayed in port, Cornelius was sailing, charging double for the risk. He earned a reputation as the most reliable, albeit the most ruthless boatman in the harbor. During the War of 1812, when the British blockaded the coast, the demand for reliable transport skyrocketed. Vanderbilt secured government contracts to supply the forts around New York Harbor. He slept only a few hours a night. He was a machine of industry, hoarding every penny, reinvesting it into more boats. By the time he was in his 20s, he was running a small fleet. But the world was changing. The age of sail was giving way to the age of steam. Many traditional sailors mocked the new steamboats. They were loud, dirty, dangerous, and prone to exploding. Vanderbilt, however, saw the future. He saw that steam meant schedules. It meant defying the wind and the tide. He sold his sailing vessels and went to work for a man named Thomas Gibbons, who was operating a steamboat line between New Jersey and New York. This was a dangerous move because the waters of New York were controlled by a state-sanctioned monopoly held by the powerful Livingston and Fulton families. It was illegal for anyone else to run a steamboat there. Vanderbilt didn't care about the law. He cared about competition. He became the captain of Gibbon's steamship, running a blockade-running operation. He would hide from the authorities, outrun the police boats, and drop passengers off in secret. He thrived on the conflict. He was a pirate in a businessman's coat. This legal battle eventually went all the way to the United States Supreme Court in the landmark case Gibbons versus Ogden. The court ruled against the monopoly, declaring that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce. Vanderbilt had won. The waters were open. With the monopoly broken, Vanderbilt struck out on his own. He unleashed a business strategy that would become his trademark, the price war. He built ships that were faster and more luxurious than his competitors, but he charged a fraction of the price. If a ticket cost $3, Vanderbilt charged one. If they matched him, he dropped it to 10 cents. If they matched that, he made the trip free and made his money on the food and drink sold on board. He ruthlessly drove competitors into bankruptcy or forced them to pay him to leave the market. By the 1840s, he was the master of the Long Island Sound and the Hudson River. He was no longer just a captain. He was the Commodore, a nickname that started as a joke but became a title of fear and respect. During the California gold rush of 1849, while thousands of men rushed west to dig for gold, Vanderbilt mined the miners. The standard route to California was a treacherous journey around the tip of South America or a land crossing at Panama. Vanderbilt found a better way. He secured rights to a route across Nicaragua. It was shorter, faster, and cheaper. He personally navigated a steamboat up the San Juan River, jumping into the water to guide the vessel over rapids when his crew was too afraid to try. He cut weeks off the journey and charged less than the Panama route. He made millions moving desperate men to the gold fields. By the 1850s, he was the wealthiest man in America, but the Commodore was never satisfied. In the early 1860s, as the Civil War raged and he approached his 70th birthday, an age when most men were long retired or dead, Vanderbilt made the most audacious pivot in business history. He looked at his vast fleet of ships, the source of all his wealth, and he sold them. All of them. He realized that the future of transportation was no longer on the water. It was on the rails. The railroads in America at that time were a mess of disjointed, competing lines. You had to change trains constantly to get anywhere. Vanderbilt saw the inefficiency and he saw the opportunity for a monopoly. He began buying up stock in the New York and Harlem Railroad, then the Hudson River Railroad. He applied the same brutal tactics he had used on the water. When competitors tried to cut him out of the rail network into Manhattan, he simply stopped his trains at the bridge into the city. He cut off the connection. Passengers were stranded in the winter snow. Livestock trains were backed up for miles. The city began to panic. The stock of his competitors crashed. Vanderbilt bought them up for pennies on the dollar. He consolidated the lines into the New York Central Railroad, creating a streamlined empire of steel that connected New York City to the heavy industry of Chicago. However, his dominance was not without challenges. The most famous battle of his life was the Erie War. Vanderbilt wanted to buy the Erie Railroad to complete his monopoly. But he was up against three men who were just as cunning as he was, though far less ethical: Jay Gould, Jim Fisk, and Daniel Drew. As Vanderbilt bought shares of the Erie Railroad to gain a controlling interest, Gould and Fisk began printing new stock certificates illegally. It was a process called watering the stock. For every share Vanderbilt bought, they printed more. He was buying paper that was essentially worthless, pouring millions into a bottomless pit. Vanderbilt, enraged, unleashed his lawyers and bought off judges. Gould and Fisk fled to New Jersey, barricading themselves in a hotel with armed guards, carrying suitcases full of cash. It was a spectacle that captivated the nation. In the end, Vanderbilt lost millions in the Erie War. He admitted he had been beaten by a different kind of criminal, but the loss barely dented his fortune. He focused on his New York Central, making it the gold standard of American travel. To symbolize his power, he decided to build a monument in the heart of New York City. At 42nd Street, which was then the northern edge of the developed city, he constructed the Grand Central Depot. It was a massive, sprawling structure of glass and iron, the largest interior space in North America at the time. He sank the tracks below street level along Park Avenue, creating the modern layout of the city. It wasn't just a train station, it was a cathedral to commerce, and he was its high priest. But while his business life was a series of conquests, his personal life was a landscape of control and disappointment. The Commodore was a tyrant at home. He had 13 children, but he viewed most of them with contempt. He believed his sons were soft, spoiled by the wealth he had created. He called his eldest son, William Henry, a blockhead and a blatherskite, exiling him to a farm on Staten Island for years to toughen him up. The only son he respected was his youngest, George Washington Vanderbilt. George was a West Point graduate, strong, disciplined, and seemingly the heir apparent. The Commodore saw himself in George. Then, tragedy struck. The Civil War was over, but the shadow of death remained. George fell ill, likely with typhoid or a similar infection, and died young. The Commodore was devastated. The one child he believed capable of handling the empire was gone. He was left with William Henry, the son he had mocked and marginalized. In his grief and desperation, the Commodore had to turn to William. He brought him back from the farm and began to test him. To everyone's surprise, including the Commodore's, William Henry was not a fool. He was quiet, yes, and he lacked his father's fiery charisma, but he was diligent. He was a master of details. He took the abuse, kept his head down, and learned the business. As the Commodore's health failed in 1876 and 1877, the weight of the future pressed down on the family. The old man was terrified that his fortune would be scattered. In his will, he did something shocking. He left 95% of his estate to William Henry. The other children received relatively small allowances. The daughters, whom he viewed as property of their future husbands, got next to nothing compared to the mountain of gold William received. The Commodore wanted the money kept together. He wanted the power concentrated. He told William Henry that he had to keep the empire intact. When the Commodore died, William Henry Vanderbilt became the richest man in the world. The press hounded him. The public envied him. And his siblings sued him. The trial over the Commodore's will was a public spectacle, airing the family's dirty laundry, the accusations of insanity, the stories of the Commodore's seances and reliance on clairvoyance. But William Henry prevailed. He settled with his siblings to make them go away, and he went to work. Critics expected William Henry to fail. They thought he was a pale shadow of his father. But as investigators of history were about to find out, this was only the tip of the iceberg. The Vanderbilt story was about to shift from a story of making money to a story of spending it in ways the world had never seen. We still have the most chilling evidence of their excess to uncover, and the seeds of their destruction are just being sown. So stay tuned. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the American oligarchy, make sure you've hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. William Henry Vanderbilt did not just hold on to the fortune, he doubled it. It remains one of the most underrated feats in business history. While his father was a builder and a conqueror, William Henry was a manager and an investor. He expanded the railroads, navigated the complex new world of corporate finance, and grew the fortune to over $200 million. In today's money, that would be worth hundreds of billions. He was richer than Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos relative to the economy of his time. But William Henry was a tired man. The stress of managing the empire, the constant public scrutiny, and threats of kidnappers and anarchists wore him down. He famously exclaimed to a reporter, "The public be damned," a quote that was taken out of context but came to symbolize the arrogance of the robber barons. In reality, he was expressing frustration with the demands on his time, but the damage was done. While William Henry made the money, the social ambitions of the family began to shift. The Vanderbilts were rich, yes, but they were not society. In the rigid class structure of 19th century New York, money wasn't enough. You needed lineage. The gatekeeper of New York society was Mrs. Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor. She came from Old Dutch money and looked down on the Vanderbilts. To her, they were rough, uneducated upstarts. The Commodore had been a ferryman who cursed and spit tobacco. They were not welcome in the ballrooms of the elite. Enter Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was not a Vanderbilt by blood. She married into the family, She was the wife of William K. Vanderbilt, one of William Henry's sons. Alva was a force of nature. She was Southern, fiery, and utterly obsessed with conquering New York society. She refused to accept the exclusion. She decided that if the Vanderbilts couldn't be invited to the party, they would throw a party so big that Mrs. Astor would have no choice but to come. The year was 1883. Alva announced a costume ball to be held at her new mansion on Fifth Avenue. This wasn't just a house. It was a French chateau planted on the streets of Manhattan, designed to make every other house look like a shack. She invited over 1,000 guests. The preparations were the talk of the city for months. Everyone who was anyone received an invitation, except for Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie. The story goes that Carrie Astor was practicing her quadrille dance for the ball, assuming she would be going. But then the realization hit. No invitation had arrived. Mrs. Astor had to face the reality that she had been outmaneuvered. If she wanted her daughter to attend the social event of the century, she had to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. Mrs. Astor famously ordered her carriage and left her calling card at Alva Vanderbilt's door. The blockade was broken. The Vanderbilts were in. The ball itself was a spectacle of unimaginable excess. It cost an estimated $3 million in today's currency for a single night. Guests wore costumes made of real gold and jewels. Alice Vanderbilt, another sister-in-law, dressed as Electric Light, wearing a gown that actually lit up with a battery hidden in the folds. There were jewelers on site to fix broken pearls. It was a declaration of victory. The Vanderbilts had bought their way to the top of the social ladder. But this victory triggered a mania for building. The children of William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius Howe II, William K., Frederick, and George, began a competition of architectural one-upmanship that stripped the family fortune of its density. They didn't just build houses, they built palaces. On Fifth Avenue, they constructed a row of mansions that were so large and ornate they were called Vanderbilt Row. But their true playground was Newport, Rhode Island, the summer retreat of the wealthy. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance-style palazzo on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. It used steel trusses, not for structural integrity, but to ensure it was fireproof, because they were terrified of their investments burning down. The walls were covered in platinum and gold leaf. The dining room was 2 stories high. It was a house built for giants, not a family. Then there was George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest of William Henry's sons. He was an intellectual, a shy man who loved books and art. He took his share of the inheritance and went to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. There, he built the Biltmore Estate. To this day, it remains the largest private home ever built in the United States. It has 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. It sits on thousands of acres of land. George spent his entire fortune building and maintaining it. He created a self-sustaining village, a forestry school, and a dairy. It was a magnificent achievement of landscape and architecture, but it was a financial black hole. This was the turning point. The Commodore had made the money. William Henry had doubled it. But the third generation was spending it on stone and mortar. They were asset-rich but cash-poor. The maintenance costs of these homes were astronomical. They required armies of servants, butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, stable hands. The heating bills alone cost a fortune. And crucially, the third generation had stopped producing. They were living off the dividends of the New York Central Railroad. But they weren't building new industries. They were gentlemen of leisure, sportsmen, yacht owners. They competed for the America's Cup. They married European royalty, trading dollars for titles. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's daughter, was famously forced into a loveless marriage with the Duke of Marlborough just so her mother could have a duchess in the family. The wedding dowry alone cost millions of dollars, money that flowed out of the American economy and into the crumbling estates of the British aristocracy. In 1885, William Henry died suddenly. He dropped dead in his study while talking to a business associate. The fortune was split among his 8 children and his wife. The concentration of wealth that the Commodore had fought for was gone. The pile of gold was divided into smaller piles, and those piles were being set on fire by the lifestyle of the Gilded Age. As the 20th century dawned, the world began to change again, just as it had for the Commodore. But this time, the Vanderbilts were not the ones driving the change. They were the victims of it. The federal government introduced the income tax. Before 1913, there was no federal income tax in America. The Vanderbilts could keep everything they made. Suddenly, the government was taking a cut. Then came the inheritance tax, or estate tax. When the wealthy members of the third generation began to die, the government took a massive chunk of their assets before they could pass them to the fourth generation. Then came the Great Depression. The 1929 stock market crash decimated the value of the New York Central Railroad. The railroad industry itself was under attack from the automobile and the airplane. The Vanderbilts, who had bet everything on rail, were slow to diversify. They watched as their primary source of income dried up. But they didn't stop spending. They continued to live as if it were 1890. They struggled to maintain the mansions. The breakers and the Biltmore became burdens. By the mid-20th century, the situation was dire. The mansions on Fifth Avenue, once the envy of the world, were being sold to real estate developers. They were too expensive to live in, and the land was too valuable. One by one, the palaces of Vanderbilt Row were smashed by wrecking balls. The art was auctioned off. The furniture was sold. The family that had owned New York was being evicted by the economics of the modern world. Consider the fate of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion on Fifth Avenue. It was the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. It was demolished in 1926 to make way for a department store, Bergdorf Goodman. The family simply couldn't afford the taxes. The stone gates of the mansion were saved and moved to Central Park, where they stand today as a quiet ruin, a testament to a lost empire. The fourth and fifth generations of Vanderbilts found themselves in a strange position. They had the famous name, but the money was evaporating. Some of them fell into tragedy. There were suicides, alcoholism, and high-profile divorces. The pressure of living up to the name without the resources to support it was crushing. They were celebrities without a cause. But as investigators were about to find out, the final unraveling of the family fortune wasn't just about bad math. It was about a total cultural shift. We still have to look at the modern legacy, the family reunion that shocked the world, and the final verdict on the Commodore's dream. So stay tuned. If you're enjoying this history, make sure to like the video. We are entering the final chapter. In 1973, 120 descendants of the Commodore gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, for the first ever family reunion. It was a moment of reflection. The media was there, expecting a gathering of tycoons. What they found was a group of ordinary people. There were no billionaires among them. In fact, there wasn't a single millionaire left among the direct descendants who relied solely on the family inheritance. Within 100 years of the Commodore's death, the fortune was effectively gone. The Commodore's fear had come true. He had built a dynasty, but he hadn't built a family culture of work. He had traumatized his children, and in turn, they had raised a generation of spenders who used money to fill the emotional voids left by their upbringing. However, the name did not disappear. It morphed. The most famous Vanderbilt of the modern era was Gloria Vanderbilt. She was the poor little rich girl, the subject of a vicious custody battle in the 1930s that captivated the nation. Her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, had drunk and gambled away his share of the fortune and died young. Gloria inherited a trust fund, but she also inherited the trauma of the spotlight. Yet Gloria did something her ancestors hadn't done in generations. She worked. She became an artist, an author, and a fashion designer. In the 1970s, she launched a line of designer jeans with her name on the back pocket. For a time, she was making more money on her own than she had inherited. She reinvented the name. It was no longer about railroads. It was about style. Her son, Anderson Cooper, became one of the most recognized journalists in the world. But Cooper has been vocal about the family history. He has famously said, "My mom made it clear to me that there's no trust fund." He grew up knowing that the Vanderbilt money was a thing of the past. He viewed the inheritance as a curse, something that sapped people of their ambition. He built his own career from the ground up, in a way returning to the spirit of the Commodore, working, hustling, and making a name for himself, albeit in media rather than shipping. The physical legacy of the Vanderbilts is now largely owned by the public. The Breakers in Newport is a museum, visited by thousands of tourists who gawk at the gold walls and wonder what it was like to live there. The Biltmore estate is still owned by the descendants of George Washington Vanderbilt, but it is run as a business, a tourist attraction that requires ticket sales to survive. It is a monument to a bygone era, preserved in amber. Grand Central Terminal in New York still stands, a bustling hub of transit, and if you look closely at the facade, you can see the statue of the Commodore, looking out over the city he helped build, his hand resting on his sword. So what is the final verdict on the House of Vanderbilt? It is a cautionary tale of the rule of thirds. The first generation builds the wealth. The second generation maintains it. The third generation loses it. The Commodore was a man of his time. Brutal, brilliant, and visionary, he understood the mechanics of making money better than anyone. But he failed to understand the mechanics of family. He believed that money could control the future, that a will written on paper could bind his descendants to his vision. He was wrong. The money bought them palaces, but it didn't buy them happiness, and it certainly didn't buy them longevity. The Vanderbilts consumed more luxury than any family in American history, and in the end, the luxury consumed them. They spent so much energy trying to be European aristocracy that they forgot how to be American entrepreneurs. They stopped climbing and started drifting, and in the shark-infested waters of capitalism, if you stop moving, you die. Today, the Vanderbilt name is plastered on university halls and museum wings funded by the philanthropy of the past. But the financial empire is dust. It serves as a reminder that wealth is fleeting. It requires purpose to sustain it. The Commodore's periauger, that small boat he bought for $100, carried him to a fortune, but his descendants, aboard their massive yachts, lost their way. Thank you for watching this full documentary into the Vanderbilt Empire. It is a story that encompasses the best and worst of the American spirit. What are your theories on their collapse? Was it the taxes, the spending, or simply the natural cycle of history? Let me know in the comments below. I read them all, and if you want to see more stories like this, unraveling the mysteries of history's greatest figures, make sure you are subscribed. I'll see you in the next video.